I would like to introduce Joshua Uebelherr. He is Senior Air Quality Planner for Maricopa County's Air Quality Department. And he works on emissions inventories and special projects related to air pollution. His projects include criteria air pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions inventory, ozone and PM10, exceptional event analysis for air quality standard exceedances, and the mowing down pollution program that funds the purchase of new electric lawn and garden equipment in exchange for recycling gas-powered equipment, which is a great program. He has a PhD in public policy and administration from ASU, go Sun Devils, School of Public Affairs, and he's also a faculty associate for ASU and Grand Canyon University. And I am just amazed that this gentleman has any time to sleep in between his full-time job and his part-time jobs, and he has 3 kids. So I'm quite impressed. So Joshua, if you'd like to further introduce yourself and get started, as a formatting thing, he would like to certainly go through his presentation. You're welcome to put your questions in the chat, and we will leave probably about 15 minutes-ish for questions at the end as well. So Joshua, so great to have you.
Thank you. I'm so glad everyone could be here. You know, this is a really great opportunity to provide a perspective for the community, for cities and towns. Again, so I'm Joshua Uebelherr, and you know, our background capability at the county level in the unit that I work in the analysis unit includes emissions inventories. So you know, it's really helpful for us to bring those resources to bear to assist the community. So this is going to be a review of the 2018 Community Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory Overview. What I think would be best is to try and hold any questions that you might have as we go along to the end, and then I'm happy to go back through any slides as questions come up at the end, and those questions are welcome and appreciated to help with clarity and to expound on anything that comes across your mind. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and get going on our content. So again, this is a community greenhouse gas emissions inventory. It's done at the county level, so it's comprehensive for our county footprint, but then within the county emissions, it's allocated to the different municipalities and the non-incorporated areas, which are also important. They're part of our county, and so, you know, they have perspective as well. From the Maricopa County Air Quality Department's perspective, this, of course, is non-regulatory. We do have responsibility under the Clean Air Act for criteria air pollutants that contribute to ozone, particulate matter, and things like that. But this is, as related to greenhouse gas emissions, is non-regulatory. Now, it is true that emissions of greenhouse gas also is associated with these criteria air pollutants. So that's where the link comes in, that it relates to what we do as our primary mission, in that reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from combustion sources is also associated with reductions in criteria air pollutants, which is our primary mission. So that's what really kind of lines up with what we do on a daily basis. Our purpose is to inform cities and towns and to provide a baseline so that they can see what things are like in their local areas. And then, you know, if later in the future this is revised, you can see how things have changed over time, whether they've gone up, they've gone down in different categories, whether they stay in the same. This is broken down by residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors generally. Means of allocation. So electricity itself is reported by the utilities according to municipal jurisdiction, and that gives us that type of breakdown. Other ways of breaking down the emissions is by population proportion, when we don't really know anything more about what's going on. For example, transportation is hard to get after because people are driving all across the region. So that's allocated by population proportion. And we'll talk a little bit more about these as we go through different categories. GIS, Geographic Information Systems, is a way where we can take the land use, the area, kilometers squared of a certain type of land use within a certain municipality from assessor records, and we can get a feel for what weight of the total emissions in certain categories that are associated with land use can be spread around the different jurisdictions or unincorporated area. Okay, so here's a quick summary of our categories. Now, I do want to mention that we used an EPA Community Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory tool, which is a very helpful tool. And it's also something that if different jurisdictions, cities and towns, unincorporated areas, were thinking about, taking a look at alternative scenarios, what if questions, what if we did this instead, what might the results look like? This is a fairly straightforward tool in terms of the overall realm of how difficult it could be to do calculations. It presents a pretty good platform for asking questions and doing planning. We use this as the baseline tool for a lot of these categories. For example, now electricity use, and we'll talk about this, we had an EPA Southwest Regional Grid factor. Mobile sources was run through the EPA MOVES model by Maricopa Association of Governments. But stationary fuels, wastewater, livestock, solid waste came from these different categories. Had various data sources, and a lot of them used the inventory tool. And we're going to go through these in detail. So the left column is a list of sources, and that contributes to the gross greenhouse gas emissions profile. On the right column, where you would see greenhouse gas uptake or a sink. And what does that mean? That's just when plants photosynthesize and they take up CO2, they incorporate that CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, into their woody tissues, carbohydrates, and so forth, and act as kind of a positive benefit to getting that out of the atmosphere. So when I take the gross emissions in the left column and subtract the uptake in the right column, I get net greenhouse gas emissions, or the total when I balance out what's emitted and what's taken up. Okay, so here is just a summary of the greenhouse gases that are considered, a few representative, some of the most important ones. Carbon dioxide is generally the most, the largest gas that's emitted, and it's a product of combustion of fuels. Nitrous oxide and methane come from combustion in very small quantities generally, but more often come from landfills, wastewater treatment, fertilizer. That's, at least nitrous oxide is wastewater, and fertilizer use, methane can be livestock, landfills, and wastewater treatment. Fluorinated gases, for example, sulfur hexafluoride. This is used in our electric systems for high voltage circuit breakers and other things. So it's, it's an important tool. It's also used in certain manufacturing processes. Carbon dioxide is the, we convert everything into metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So we're always talking about apples to apples, even if N2O, nitrous oxide, or methane might have been the gas sources for a particular contribution to the emissions, the greenhouse gas potential. It's going to be converted to metric ton CO2 equivalent so that we're all kind of on the same playing field. And this is just done by taking the greenhouse gas potential. Almost a little over 250 times more powerful than CO2 is nitrous oxide. So it's really much more potent. Methane, up to 36 times more potent than CO2. And this is kind of on a 100-year basis. And fluorinated gases like sulfur hexafluoride, 22,800 times more powerful than CO2. So that's how we kind of convert to common units. So we're always talking about the same thing, even if different gases are what's under consideration. Okay, so electricity use. APS and SRP were very helpful partners in providing data on the 2018 consumption. Now here's the one, and I'll mention this with the imported water use, but everything is particular to Maricopa County except for electricity use. That's what we consume, and some of what we consume in Maricopa County might have been generated outside of the county in power plants outside of the county. But this is what we cause. This is what we drive these emissions through our consumption. We use the, it's divided by the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors, so we can get an idea by jurisdiction and as the county for a whole, what different sectors of the economy are consuming. And we use, and I'll get into this, a sulfur hexafluoride for the system is, again, the electric system insulator. It's quite a bit more potent. This data comes from the EPA flight tool, and I'll talk a little bit more about that tool. But basically, this is what the utilities have reported in 2018 for that particular gas. And those sulfur hexafluoride emissions are allocated by population proportion and proportion of sector electricity use within each municipality. So again, sulfur hexafluoride, though it is potent, it's a very, very small proportion of the overall signature from the electricity use sector, but it is included. Okay, so the emission factor we used for the electricity that's consumed is from the EPA 2018 e-grid summary tables. So this is for the Southwest US grid intensity for CO2 equivalent, and it's 0.466 metric tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. And here's a quick link to where that factor comes from. Likewise, here is the EPA sulfur hexafluoride electric utility emissions link to where the data comes from, you know, from the EPA reported emissions from that sector for SF6, or sulfur hexafluoride. Here's a quick summary of the 2018 electricity use for Maricopa County as a whole. We can see that the residential sector is, you know, 46.3%. We also have the terawatt hours in parentheses, just in terms of raw power consumption for electricity. You know, so that it shows where these are coming from. Commercial space, buildings, offices, facilities, institutions, 38.7%. And then industrial, so manufacturing processes and so forth, 15%. So at the bottom, we have the total quantities and the percentage. This is 21.8 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. It's 42%, 42.6% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the county in 2018. Okay, and I'm presenting these in decreasing order of magnitude. So mobile sources is a close second behind electricity. This is calculated, as I mentioned, using the EPA motor vehicle emissions simulator, or the MOVES model. So we have on-road, right? So like you think, trucks, buses, transportation, cars, non-road. So this would be, you know, off-road vehicles, construction equipment, and airports, takeoffs, landings, ground equipment used to support aircraft. This is a model run by the Maricopa Association of Governments. So that's where that data comes from. And also there's locomotives. Now, the data was only available for 2017 for locomotives. It's a fairly intensive survey process. So we assumed that the, you know, commercial, right, locomotive cargo transport in 2017 was representative of 2018. And these were all allocated to the municipalities and unincorporated area by population. Not knowing any more detail about the intensity of citizens' use across those jurisdictions. Here is a profile of the 2018 mobile sources for the county. And we can see that personal vehicles, right, take up 60.4%, so, you know, the largest slice. Trucks, short haul, long haul, right, transit of cargo, 22.5%. And then non-road is 12.1%, airport 4%, and locomotives and public transit making up approximately 0.5% each, as the smaller quantities. And we can see that there's 20.8 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or 40.7% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory for 2018 for the county. Okay, so coming in third now, quite a bit further down the line, this is the last of the three major categories, but this is only 10%, not 40% like the first two categories. Stationary fuel use. We use the greenhouse gas emissions tool from EPA in order to calculate the emissions from this, and basically the 2017 ozone periodic emissions inventory that we do for criteria air pollutants is what is used for the data source for these emissions. Now, we didn't assume that they were the same. We said, population grew from 2017 to 2018, so we increased those fuel consumption levels by a small percentage according to population growth. Population growth in each municipality and unincorporated area over that time. So very fine scale population growth allocation of these emissions. One caveat is that residential LPG wasn't available in 2017, and so the 2014 values were grown to 2018 or extrapolated using population in the same fashion. So generators, boilers, heaters, and industrial processes, your hot water heater at your residence that uses natural gas, or so not electric hot water heaters, but fuel combustion. Fuel types include fuel oil, which is like distillate oil, similar to diesel, that can be used in industrial processes, liquefied propane gas, LPG, natural gas, and we allocated this, again, by municipal population weight. This was 5.1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or 10% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the county for the year 2018. Okay, so we have wastewater. So now we're starting to get into the smaller categories. Wastewater produces nitrous oxide and methane because there's a lot of organic content, and these are processed often in conditions that microbes, as they break down products, produce these gases, and they can be quite a bit more potent than CO2. We use the EPA greenhouse gas emissions tool. We took surveys of the wastewater treatment facilities in the Maricopa County to get the parameters required to use in the EPA greenhouse gas emissions tool, and it's actually quite detailed. You can imagine the engineering nature of wastewater treatment. You need to know quite a bit of information in order to make a calculation. The tool tells us what parameters we need. We collect those via surveys, so we had a lot of help from wastewater treatment facility managers in the county, so we're very thankful for their cooperation and partnership. What's left over also are septic systems, so the population that's not hooked up to a wastewater treatment facility that also generates emissions. We again use the EPA greenhouse gas emissions tool to calculate septic emissions. We use the population survey in the questionnaire for treatment facilities in terms of how much population they serve to figure out what residual portion of population is not being accounted for by wastewater treatment, which matches up very well to the most recent US Census data on the amount or percentage of the population on septic. And so it's good that we had agreement, and that's how we calculated again in the EPA greenhouse gas tool. We allocated these emissions to municipalities by population. Again, the assumption is that on a per capita basis, this is fairly equally distributed, but also we don't necessarily have any additional information about how to do a different allocation. So 900, so now we're below 1 million metric tons for this category, 947,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or 1.8% of the total greenhouse gas emissions inventory for 2018 for the county. Livestock. So we're talking about beef and dairy cattle, and these are, so Cattle are considered the most greenhouse gas intensive in terms of methane of the different types of livestock. This is why they're considered. We got the data for the count or the quantity of livestock from the National Agricultural Statistics Service. This comes from 2017. There was no 2018 data available. We assumed that they were the same for 2018. We didn't grow them or change the numbers. We just used the 17 numbers as a proxy for 2018. These emissions were allocated to municipalities by GIS land use for cattle. So we can see from the assessor's office which land use parcels are tagged with codes for cattle, and we basically do the emissions calculations overall and then divide them up based on land use proportions. Now, the factors used for calculation: beef cattle, 1.53 metric tons CO2 equivalent per animal year, dairy cattle, 7.39. This is, these are emissions that come from enteric fermentation. What does that mean? It means within their digestive tract, right, they're able to break down cellulose from eating vegetation, and it requires microbes. Those microbes, no oxygen, they make methane. Methane's the greenhouse gas, but also manure management and emission factors associated with that also generates emissions for methane. And this comes from Wolf, Azrar, and West 2017. It's kind of a good methodological paper. Okay, and then this, again, is under 1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent at 904,000 approximately. Again, similar to wastewater, 1.8% of our county greenhouse gas emissions inventory for 2018. Here we can just see a top-down view of a landfill. This is solid waste. You can see how just in the image, the solid waste is deposited and then it's covered up with soil and kind of this repeating process as it builds in height. This comes in large part, the emissions, methane, from an environment without oxygen where microbes are degrading organic waste, like food scraps. There are other components, but that's the primary one. This comes from primary EPA facility level information on greenhouse gas tool flight. That's by and large where the data came from for this category. We did have one facility, I think it was the Salt River Landfill, where we used survey data because it wasn't well represented in the flight tool. And this tells us directly from the EPA database what the emissions were. And we allocated the emissions by population, kind of not really knowing exactly how the land use, or I'm sorry, the landfill intensity might have been different among different municipalities and unincorporated areas. So that's how we did that. And this was 656,000 metric tons CO2 equivalent, or 1.3% of the total greenhouse gas emissions inventory for 2018. Okay, so this next category is 2018 manufacturing gases. So again, this comes from the EPA flight tool. So it's allocated by population. So part of this is that even though different manufacturing efforts might occur kind of concentrated in certain areas, it's a regional benefit in terms of employment. People come from all over the place to participate in these efforts, and so that's how it's allocated by population, being a regional employment benefit. Here's a list on the right column of some of the typical gas types that are considered in the EPA flight tool for manufacturing gases: methane, nitrous oxide, a few kind of interesting ones: nitrogen trifluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, hydrofluoroethers, very short-lived compounds, and other fully fluorinated greenhouse gases. And again, a lot of these are very potent, even if they might be used in small quantities. But their overall signature in the in the inventory is 565,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent at 1.1% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory for 2018 for the county as a whole. Imported water. So here's where the Central Arizona project, this is where we're considering, pumps water using electricity from the Colorado River over various elevation points into Maricopa County for use by the region. In 2018, 335,000 acre feet of water was pumped into the county. We have an electricity footprint per acre foot of 1,525 kilowatt hours per acre foot. Source for this data was ASU Decision Center for Desert Cities. We're very thankful for their help on this. We used the same emission factor for the electricity sector for this at 0.466 because it's the same regional grid, and it's a pretty small relative contribution. We allocated it by population to the different jurisdictions at 238,000 metric tons CO2 equivalent, or 0.5% of the total greenhouse gas emissions inventory for 2018 for the county as a whole. And then we have fertilizer use. So again, fertilizer, it's used for different applications. We use the EPA greenhouse gas emissions tool to calculate the actual emissions. This is nitrous oxide. Again, fertilizer is made of nitrogen, it combines with oxygen, and this can come from farm use, non-farm use, residential, parks, golf courses, the like. The data we used was a U.S. Geologic Survey 2012 research paper on county level fertilizer use, and we extrapolated that using a linear regression model to 2018 in order to get the 2018 levels. The municipal allocation for the unincorporated areas was with GIS land use, again, from the county assessor's office. The one caveat here is that crops and residents and parks and golf courses, particularly golf courses, they have different kind of typical intensity applications of fertilizer based on the type. And so we used literature data to kind of allocate the overall fertilizer use to the different land uses by a weighted by land use type and area of GIS coverage to get the kind of distribution across the different municipalities. This is a small portion of the relative contribution, 123,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent at 0.2% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory for the county for 2018. And then kind of now we're done with the gross greenhouse gas emission sources, and here's our sink or uptake through photosynthesis of CO2 into the leaves in exchange for oxygen to make plant carbohydrates. We have the EPA EnviroAtlas database. This is a database of percent tree cover, and it's satellite data. Now, it's not a perfect database. It doesn't cover the entire county, so we applied this where available, and I'll show you a little bit more about this. But CO2 uptake was estimated in terms of the area of coverage for available data using the EPA greenhouse gas tool to estimate how much CO2 is being taken up by urban forestry from tree cover percentage from the satellite data. We allocated to municipality and the economic sectors within the municipalities based on the land use type category from the GIS data, saying what type of land is being used for residential, commercial, or industrial. This is, so it's a negative value because it's being taken out of the atmosphere, 160,000 metric tons CO2 equivalent. Here's a quick perspective on the data. As you can see, it doesn't cover every area perfectly, and there's some areas that fall completely out of it, and I'm going to show you this in a second. This is just to give you kind of a visual reference for what the satellite data looks like. And our next table shows that this is a list of jurisdictions or unincorporated area with less than 100% tree cover data availability. So if it's not on this list, it means that the data covered the whole area of the jurisdiction. Here we have, for example, the first row, Apache Junction. It means 0.2% was available. So 9.8% was missing. So it doesn't mean that these, municipalities or unincorporated areas don't have vegetation cover. It just means the data wasn't available for the resource that we had at hand. So that's just something to be taken with a grain of salt. Okay, so here's kind of our big picture. The gross greenhouse gas emissions for the county as a whole, 51.2 approximately million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Right, the urban forestry sink or uptake from photosynthesis is negative 160,000 metric tons CO2 equivalent. We take the difference by summing those, the positive and negative, the gross and the urban forestry, to get the net greenhouse gas emissions for the county, 51.1 million metric tons CO2 equivalent. We divide that number by the total population of the county in 2018, that's 11.9 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per person in that year of emissions. How do we compare to the nation as a whole? Well, our per capita emissions are lower in 2018 than the US average per capita emissions in 2018. So, that's a good thing. We're at 11.9. The US average is over 20 metric ton CO2 equivalent per person. So, that's something that's encouraging. Here's a table that summarizes all of the different, this is not the forestry uptake, but all the gross sources, the total amount and the relative percentage. And this is also available in the report, and I'll list that website as we get towards the end here. Here's a visual representation of the relative contributions of the different sources in this exploded pie chart. The vast majority is taken up by, so 93.3% is, the electricity, mobile, and stationary fuel sources. So that's just showing us that there's all the other sources besides those are only 6.7%. Sources of variation. So one thing I will draw your attention to is that in the report, in the appendix, we've created the same set of profile information you just saw in the overview summaries and the table and the pie chart. We've done that for every city or town and the unincorporated areas so that you can look and see what's going on at these local levels. But know that the sources of variation between cities and towns are going to be sourced from nothing in the right column on this slide, because all of those are allocated by population. So those are all going to be even Steven across the jurisdictions. When jurisdictions differ from the county profile or from one another, it's because of electricity as reported by the utilities consumption, livestock by land use, fertilizer use, again land use, and urban forestry, again available data and the satellite imagery intensity of the forest cover. But that's a small part of it, at least the forestry. So that's one way to think about that. Here's where the report can be found. It's the website right there. It has the emission profiles for municipalities, as I mentioned in the appendix. There's a master data file that shows the raw data that went into the report. And there's also a resource of example of emission reduction programs that was compiled of kind of what other locations are doing in this regard. That brings me to the end. I appreciate your time. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me and let me know how I can be of assistance to explain anything you might have or help in any way.